welcome to this very special program hosted by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai. I'm the Director of Research at the MHS, and I'm also joined today by Katy Morris, who is the Assistant Director of Research here at the MHS. We shall be handling everything in the background to make sure everything runs smoothly. We would like to extend a special welcome to members of the Society of American Historians who may be joining us for the first time. If you are unfamiliar with us, we encourage you to visit our brand new website at www.masshist.org to learn more about the MHS. We are the nation's oldest historical society, founded in 1791. We are free and open to the public, and we welcome you and encourage you to visit and page through our 14 million manuscript pages. The MHS also offers research fellowships to support graduate students and faculty. And also during the academic year, we sponsor 7 seminar series. Here's just a listing of the 7 seminar series. We encourage you to visit our website to see what is coming up during this season. Indeed, your moderator for this evening is a member of the steering committee for the New England Biography Series. All right. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce your moderator for this evening. Megan Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson Professor at Emerson College, a distinguished scholar and author. Her biography, The Peabody Sisters, 3 Women Who Ignited American Romanticism, won the Francis Parkman Prize awarded by the Society of American Historians. Her book, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Biography and Memoir. Her latest is Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast. Professor Marshall's writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, the New York Times Book Review, Slate, and the London Review of Books, among others. She is a former president of the Society of American Historians. Megan, the floor is yours.
And I'm just so glad to have this opportunity to be here and celebrate the 2021 winners of the writing prizes of the Society of American Historians. I've been involved in many programs hosted by the MHS, but this one is particularly meaningful to me. As last year's president of the Society of American Historians, it was my sad duty to cancel for a second year the annual dinner at which these prizes in historical writing are announced and conferred due to the pandemic. Tonight gives us the opportunity, thanks to the MHS, to bring the Society's 2021 prize winners together for a public program, something the SAH has never done before. And I think also a rare occasion for the MHS, in which historical writers of different genres, treating disparate eras and at varying stages in their careers, will present their work and join in conversation for one precious hour. These prizes are judged by selected members of the Society on a volunteer basis. I know some jury members are tuning in tonight, and I want to express deep gratitude to all of you for your work in reading the multitude of submissions in each of these fields. Thank you. You know who you are. I also want to thank Andy Tucker, the SAH's Executive Secretary, for all that she does. Andrew Del Banco, our current president, for his leadership, and Vice President Annette Gordon-Reed for waiting in the wings for her term as president the following year. So we're going to proceed alphabetically with each of the winners telling a bit about their work and reading a short passage from their book, or in the case of the Nevins Prize, dissertation. I'll introduce the writers and read the jury citation before each of them speaks. Then I'll have some questions for the writers, and we hope to have time for audience questions too. Above all, I hope the program this evening will encourage you to buy and read these inspiring new books. So beginning with Afia Atakora. Afia was born in the UK and raised in New Jersey, where she now lives. She holds an MFA from Columbia University, where she was the recipient of the D'Alba Fellowship. Conjure Women is her first novel, and it is the 15th winner of the Society of American Historians Prize for Historical Fiction. This prize is awarded biennially for a book of historical fiction on an American subject that makes a significant contribution to historical understanding, portrays authentically the people and events of the historical past, and displays skill in narrative construction and prose style. And here's what the prize jury had to say about Conjure Women. Afia Atakora took for herself an extremely challenging task, recreating, peopling, and building a vanished historical world that is underrepresented in published and archival sources. She unequivocally succeeded. Her characters, situations, and scenes are richly imagined and compelling, and her prose, at the same time, poetic and precise. Conjure Women is deeply informed by history. Moving forward and backward in time, the novel weaves in a long stretch of our nation's vexed and complicated past of enslavement, the Civil War, emancipation and freedom, of gruesome racism and troubled friendships across lines of race. Atakora makes excellent use of the sources that are available, including the WPA slave narratives, to tell the stories of many intertwined lives in ways that are intricate and suspenseful. I can say that's very true. I could hardly bear to put this book down, absorbing and illuminating. So Afia, tell us a bit about the book and then maybe set up the passage you're going to read for us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to the SAH for this huge honor. As you mentioned, Conjure Women is my first novel, and I must say I'm a bit intimidated to be here amongst historians because I do get away with making things up a lot. But you know, I feel that I've always sort of had a passion for history and for the way that stories sort of travel and change and mutate. And I think Conjure Women in a lot of ways is about history sort of being handed down and reshaped and shared. And so to be recognized for this honor and to be recognized for that concept being a large part of the book is very huge for me. So thank you so much. Yeah, I think you said it all about, you know, it's Conjure Women, it travels back and forth through time. So it goes just after the Civil War and just before. But the main character is Rue, and she is a midwife in a sort of isolated town of recently freed slaves. And she sort of is attached to the old ways, the ways she learned from her mother, again, that sort of passing down of knowledge. But she is also trying to find her own way in this new world, in this new definition of freedom. And she's challenged by a visiting preacher who is sort of the revivalist motivation, who comes into town and sort of sweeps everyone up. And he's very charismatic. And so he's sort of her antagonist in the story, and she's trying to decide who she is and where she fits in with this sort of religious fervor that has taken over the town. So with that, I will share a little passage. This is entitled Surrender, 1865. It had been in the high heat of June, 2 years back, that Black folks had been freed. When the last of the war's rebel fires petered towards surrender, gossip of that lofty proclamation had finally come to their isolated corner of torn up country, the weight of it all winnowed down so that they hardly knew what any of it meant, what good it might do them. Freedom seemed to them to be as useless as a currency of a nation that didn't exist anymore. Then Bra Abel had come again amongst them for the first time. He appeared one hot day, late that June, gusted in as unexpected as cool air off the distant ocean. He'd arrived only days after they'd been told that they, slave folks all of their lives, were free. That nonsense word. He had come and defined it for them, came into their square and showed them just how free could saunter into town and say the most dangerous, daring things. This is to be our prosperity, Bra Abel predicted. This will be the promised time for Black folks. So that's a bit of a taste of the ideas.
Thank you. I love hearing you read, hearing that in your voice, though reading it, the voice is powerful too. Okay, Brianna, Nofil earned her PhD at Columbia University under the direction of May Nye. and is currently assistant professor of history at the College of William and Mary. Her dissertation, Detention Power, Jails, Camps, and the Origins of Immigrant Incarceration, 1900 to 2002, is the 61st winner of the Allan Nevins Prize. Named for the Society of American Historians founder, the Nevins Prize is awarded annually to a doctoral dissertation on an American subject. The winning dissertation is published by one of the publisher members of the Society, and I'm thrilled to announce that Princeton University Press will be the publisher of Brianna Nofil's manuscript. The jury's citation reads, in a field that included many superb entries, Nofil's work was notable for its depth and breadth of research, including work in more than 90 local newspapers, its chronological and geographical range, and the moral urgency of its prose. Detention Power looks at the reliance of federal immigration policy on local law enforcement agencies from the early 20th century onward, demonstrating the political and human consequences of framing immigration policy as a criminal justice problem. Immigrant detention, Nofil reveals, shaped the political economy of communities on the northern and southern borders alike as they sought federal funds in return for turning local jails into detention facilities. She demonstrates the often shocking conditions that men, women, and children seeking entry to the United States had to endure. Finally, and I think this is really a remarkable part of the thesis as I've read it, Nofil illuminates the resistance that detention policy long has faced, both in the broader political community and from people confined within the jails themselves. So Brianna, tell us a little more and then read for us.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here with you all. Yeah, so this is my dissertation. It's a century-long story of basically how we came to live with the immigration detention system that we live with today, a system that relies not only on federal immigration detention centers and private prisons, but also relies on hundreds of county jails, often probably the county jail in your community is detaining immigrants. And it gets really little attention. And in many ways, these migrants that are held within jails are perhaps even more invisible than migrants elsewhere in the system. And so I think what my project's trying to do is it's trying to show that profit has been part of this system since the very beginning. As early as the turn of the 20th century, sheriffs and communities are making money off of the project of incarcerating migrants. But I'm also trying to show that resistance has been part of this story from the very beginning. From the earliest days, migrants used this time in detention to organize, to bring lawsuits, and also just to bring awareness to kind of what they were experiencing. And resistance from these communities is also part of the story from the beginning. From its earliest days, people are asking questions about if it's ethical or Christian or legal to hold people who are essentially in jail for crossing a border in their local jail. So I'm just going to read to you the first paragraph of the dissertation.
2 paragraphs. Read the 2 paragraphs.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I don't know if I can. Okay. All right. So in 1925. A journalist from northern New York wrote about a peculiar arrangement that had taken root in county jails throughout the region. New York's 4 northernmost counties, located along the Canadian border, had jails filled not just with accused criminals or local lawbreakers, but with immigrant detainees awaiting immigration hearings and deportations. The journalist opined that the federal government had transformed county jails into boarding houses, paying localities a nightly rate for each detained migrant. He described the scene as follows. Here, almost daily, federal officers call for aliens. They are handcuffed. They are led through the main streets of this village to be photographed. Yet the spotlight that plays around Ellis Island is not trained upon our small county jails. Rural jails and the immigration officials that relied on them did the same work of sifting, adjudicating, and excluding migrants, but with a fraction of the attention fixed on federal immigration stations. These jails were sites of coercion and sites of neglect. Dozens of detainees had died in northern New York's dangerously overcrowded facilities while waiting for backlogged immigration hearings. But they were also sites where migrants lodged legal claims and fought for the right to stay in the United States. While Ellis Island became the quintessential image of immigrant processing in the early 20th century, it was at county jails that the federal government stretched its discretionary authority, held migrants for the longest durations, and created enduring relationships between federal bureaucracy and American communities. 94 years later, in December 2019, the New York Times published an article about the consulting firm McKinsey and its work with immigration and customs enforcement, ICE. In an attempt to save the agency money, McKinsey had made controversial recommendations that included cutting spending on food and on medical care for detainees. But perhaps McKinsey's most sweeping proposal was a call for ICE to adopt a long-term strategy with, quote, operational decisions to fill low-cost beds before expensive beds. In practice, this meant sending immigrant detainees to less expensive, less safe facilities, primarily rural county jails. In both 1925 and 2019, county jails were central to the project of federal immigration law enforcement. But in both cases, contemporaries focused on centralized federal sites of detention. Overlooking the role of county jails in carrying out deportations has enormous political stakes in the present, but it also has major historiographical implications for how we understand the functioning of the federal immigration bureaucracy, the multi-sided project of American state building, and the intertwined histories of criminal and administrative law enforcement.
Thanks so much, Brianna. I think that second paragraph really shows the scope of the time frame you've covered, and what a remarkable work for a student. So thank you. Christopher Tomlins, the author of 3 other books, including Freedom Bound, Law, Labor, and Civic Identity in Colonizing English America, 1580 to 1865, is the Elizabeth Jocelyn Bolt Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley. His new book, In the Matter of Nat Turner, A Speculative History, is the 64th winner of the SAH's Francis Parkman Prize, awarded annually to a nonfiction book that is distinguished by its literary merit and makes an important contribution to the history of what is now the United States. I'll add that the papers of the 19th century historian Francis Parkman, for whom the prize is named, are held here at the Mass Historical Society, if anyone wants to look into him. In the Matter of Nat Turner, the Parkman Prize jurors wrote, Christopher Tomlins ingeniously reconstructs an event and a man we thought we knew, the tragic 1831 slave insurrection in Virginia and its near mythic leader, Nat Turner. The significance of this book extends well beyond the news story it tells. The author takes us on his journey of discovery, offering penetrating new readings of the existing evidence, subtly deciphering Turner's extensive use of religious language, and forging new connections between the event and the larger context of the legal power, violence, and political forces arrayed against any opponent of slavery. The book is also a masterclass in the craft of history. By sharing his reflections and speculations throughout the book, Tomlins allows the reader to appreciate every facet of his interrogation of the actions taken by Turner and other key figures in the story. In addition, Tomlins offers a profound new interpretation of the Confessions of Nat Turner, the original version, based on the interview by Thomas Ruffin Gray shortly after the insurrection. It is the one document that gives us clues to Turner's motives. Through his exegesis, Tomlins recovers Turner's agency, treats him on his own terms as an intellectual, shows that his religious beliefs sprang from a deep knowledge of the Bible, and reveals him as a keenly perceptive student of the Virginia slaveholding society in which he lives. And as Turner acts on his apocalyptic and messianic desires, the author forces us into a productively unsettling confrontation with what Turner called the work of death. and its consequences. So Chris, tell us a little more and read to us.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm deeply grateful to the Society for the honor of the prize. I've told friends of mine who've asked about it that it's just a very, very cool prize to win. The idea that one's work can be found to have literary merit is deeply pleasing. The book is, as I think about it, and it changes in my mind as I think about it. It changed in my mind from the moment that I finished writing it. I now think of it as a book about, it's a book about text, or texts, plural. It investigates the key text, the pamphlet, the Confessions of Nat Turner, in as gritty detail and grainy empirical fashion as possible. But it also brings to that investigation a series of perspectives which I have developed over the years from my interactions with social science colleagues, anthropologists, sociologists, criminologists, and also my own interests in, as they developed in literary theory. I try to put the story of Nat Turner, who has fascinated me for years, until the point arrived when I could actually feel like I could take him on. I try to place that persona, that story, in the stream of prior studies of Turner and the event of the Turner Rebellion. Notably, William Styron's intensely controversial novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner, published in 1967, partly because Styron in that novel attempted what he called a meditation on history, but was singularly unable to explain precisely what he meant by that. And so I try to give him the credit where it's due of the attempt, and then I try to offer my own meditation on history through the study of this extraordinary person, Nat Turner. The real sort of struggle that I had, and this is to explain the section, the portion that I chose to make my reading from the book. The real struggle that I had in the book is, in thinking about the book and writing the book, is to deal with the very different elements that constitute the story of Nat Turner. After all, the pamphlets that Thomas Ruffin Gray produced gives one access to Turner as intellect, and in particular as a deeply religious intellect, an intellect motivated by an extraordinary, I argue, Christian evangelical faith. But the exploration of Turner's intellect leads one to worry as author, as inquirer, about the utter reality of his work of death, that is the extraordinarily violent massacre of white slaveholding families, mostly women and children, that took place. So I kind of avoided thinking about that massacre for a long time while I was trying to figure out how to write about it. And in the end, I decided that the only way to write about it was to write about it in all of its utter violence, and to do so as uncompromisingly as possible. There is a further element of the book which takes the story into Virginia history and politics, the wider context of Turner and his rebellion. But I want to, what I want to do is just read the conclusion of the chapter that I spend writing about the event of the Turner Rebellion, the actual massacre that took place itself. And this follows a description of the violent deaths of Turner and his Confederates at the hands of Southampton County's court, and his hanging and his dissection. At law's core lies the body, scourged with words. Law's penalties incise the bodies of the condemned. Kafka's punishment machine wrote with a harrow. At about the 6th hour of the harrow's work, too exhausted to scream anymore, the condemned would begin slowly to comprehend his sentence. And as death approached and realization dawned, the face of the condemned would begin to glow with the radiance of justice. There is no law that is not inscribed on bodies, says the anthropologist Michel de Certeau. Law takes hold of bodies in order to make them its text. Massacre also scourges bodies to create script. In Southampton County, bodily brutality perpetrated by ordinary persons against others with whom they may have previously lived in relative amity created a text that followed the logic of the sacred through murder to its own distinct radiance of justice. This justice owed nothing to law. Its text was one of brutal intrusions of justice beyond law. Nat Turner's work of death was what Walter Benjamin would come to call divine violence. Law answered massacre with its own work of death. For Hegel, crime is a negation of right that carried within itself its own negation, the reaffirmation of right through the medium of punishment. The punishment could not negate the crime of massacre, because massacre, though it was the work of wretches and bandits, had not been a negation of right at all. It had been rather a rupture of the reality endured by those wretches and bandits, the reality of their enslavement. It had torn into that reality and its attendant ethics, and it had put in their place, however ephemerally, something entirely distinct, an event. An event, says Alain Badiou, is the creation of a new possibility. An event, he says, changes not only the real, but also the possible. An event is at the level, not of simple possibility, but of a level of possibility of possibility. And at that level, at the level of possibility, the Southampton dialectics disjunctions could persist, and they did. And that's it.
Thank you, Chris. Well, that's a very rich passage that you've read, and it leads me to a question I wanted to ask Afia about just thinking about the possibility of possibility. That sounds very much like a fiction writer's challenge. But one of the things that was so powerful in Chris's book was his really taking apart the Styron fiction based on Nat Turner's life, and showing in a way the violence that that work had done. I wonder partly whether you have paid any attention to that Styron book, but in your writing historical fiction, what is it that you hope to do? And you don't need to talk about it in relation to Styron because he did it. But what you're doing is something quite different, inventing a world and with a great authenticity. I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about your views on historical fiction.
Yeah, I've most definitely read Confessions of Nat Turner. I think I read it for the first time while I was writing Conjure Women, not on purpose, just just happened to fall that way in a course I was taking, actually. But I think all of that, all of the sort of tradition of historical fiction and again of storytelling, all of that informed what I was trying to do, because I was very much aware that slave stories had been told, that they had been told in slave narratives written by the slaves or communicated by the slaves themselves, that they had been written and reimagined, Roots, Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, just sort of this tradition of storytelling and reimagining these times that we can't place ourselves in them, and what sort of strength is there in imagining, and what had been done with that imagination, and where had that imagination not taken us yet, which is where sort of the magical elements come into play for my book. I felt something I hadn't seen before, and something that was maybe in conversation in, say, in Beloved, for example, in Toni Morrison's Beloved, but maybe had not been extended in the way that it might have been if it was written in the 2000s or 2020. So for me, working in that tradition of expectations was huge, and I think that's a play in history itself, is what has come before and how can we sort of build on that. So yeah, I think it all weighed very heavily to humble age.
Yeah, were you one of the? I mean, I teach in an MFA program, and not too many students really dare to go to writing history because it's just really hard, Were you one of few in your program who was working on a historical novel, or was there a coterie of historian fiction writers?
Yeah. I went to Columbia, so it's quite a large program, actually. So I managed to find my people a little bit there, but I will say definitely contemporary fiction was a driving thing, sort of, especially set in, say, New York. So it was fun to sort of create a world, but also study that world, study what we knew about it. And like I was saying, sort of build on the expectations of historical fiction.
Great, thank you. So Brianna, I have a question for you. The other two works we're thinking about tonight are relatively confined in their time frame, but your project has sort of enormous scope. And I wonder how you decided to set yourself that challenge. Was it daunting? Did it seem to be the only way? I mean, because one of your many talents as a writer of history is also in these kind of wonderful stories of the immigrants, certain cases that came to, you did this mining of the newspapers. You could have probably just chosen one incident and looked at the ramifications, but you went all the way. How did that come about?
Yeah, so this project started because I was interested in a detention center in the community I grew up in South Florida. And sort of the lore around this detention center was that it was sort of the first. And it was created in the 1980s when there is a pretty significant mass migration of asylum seekers out of Haiti and Cuba. And the Reagan administration wants some place to put these people. And so they basically reinvent detention in the 1980s. And so that had always been sort of like the story, and it seemed to be kind of the historical narrative too around detention, that it's a product of the Cold War and that it is sort of a result of this punitive turn in American politics. But I had like an inkling that there was something more to it. And I looked through papers and it was really hard to find any mention of immigration detention earlier outside of like your Ellis Island and your Angel Island. And then at some point I found in just one of these Northern New York newspapers, they were talking about like, isn't it a little peculiar that our jail is filled with Chinese people? Like, it was just like a piece sort of questioning like, how did this end up happening? And then from there, that really sparked it for me, that sort of the reason it's so hard to find these people is because it's so decentralized. Like that was so much of its power to stay invisible was because it wasn't just at Ellis Island. It's because it was in, your county jail in Nebraska, your county jail in the Canadian border. And so from there, it really sort of became clear to me that the only way to tell this story is as a national story, and as a long national story, because you kind of just can't pick a few locations because they're so dispersed throughout the country. And I think that we often think of detention as sort of something that takes place on the US-Mexican border primarily. But for most of the 20th century, the locus is in places that you sort of wouldn't expect. And it's propping up local economies in places where you don't even think of them as sort of, major destinations for immigrants. So I think sort of showing the through lines through the 20th century, but also showing how even as the immigration services tools shift, even as they embrace private facilities, or even as they start building their own facilities, they never lose this reliance on county jails. And part of the reason they never lose this reliance is because it gives them a footprint in every community in America. Sort of regardless of where you apprehend someone, if the sheriff's willing to give you jail space, you don't necessarily need to build a detention center there. You have a detention center there. So that's sort of, I guess that's how I ended up with this.
Well, one of the, I think, brilliant, achievements of this long time frame is we also get to see the development of the vocabulary or the messaging around immigration. And, initially we see these, as they're described in the press at the time, these cooperative Chinese immigrants who, as you think of it, at least when you read about it in the press, they, it's practically a hotel, even if, of course, it's much worse. But, by the time we're in the 80s, suddenly these terms of illegal immigrants and the more demonizing of these people who simply want a better place, want to, and the the eroding of the sense of asylum. It's just so becomes so evident through following the line that you've traced. Was that a surprise to you? How it shifted over time, the sense of who the people were that were being? Yeah,
I think that detention it's always been punitive. That it falls under this. The Supreme Court says in the 1880s that it is not punishment, but it's been punishment from its earliest ages. But I think one thing that really stuck out to me is that sort of the ease with which the immigration service can convince communities that this is something they want to be a part of, that this is a good use of resources, that they should work with them. Is really dependent on who the immigrants are. So when the Chinese are coming, all these sheriffs want a piece of this pie. They're fighting each other to get Chinese migrants sent to their jails rather than the neighbors' jails, because they see them as sort of these people they can treat pretty poorly, and they're not going to complain in their mind. But once the demographics start changing into the 10s and 20s, when we get the passage of quota law, more and more of the people who are moving through these jails are going to be Europeans who are trying to evade quotas for their country. So now these jails that were holding Chinese migrants are holding European children, women, families. And all of a sudden, these sheriffs are not so excited about the project of immigration detention anymore. They say, people in our community are really uncomfortable with this. And, they start to raise these big ethical questions about, like, maybe immigration detention shouldn't even be a practice in this country. But, these questions and the challenge of detaining, it really depends on, and in particular, the race and ethnicity of.
Yeah, we get to the Haitian crisis and Cuba. Anyway, it's all there in Brianna's book, which will one day be a book. So Chris, you have written histories that span centuries, but in this book, you chose pretty much an isolated incident, although you look before it and afterward. Was it kind of a liberating to go small and unmute yourself? So.
Well, the original intention was after finishing the book that you mentioned in your introduction, Freedom Bound, which I had worked on for 15 years, and which kind of covers half a millennium of Anglo-American history. Indeed, I thought that I was taking on something more precise, something smaller, more that I could understand as a kind of microcosm. And then, 6 months in, and I was writing about God, and that surprised me, and it reminded me that there really is no, you can play with scale, but you will always find complexity wherever you look. By saying that, I don't mean to sort of fetishize complexity as the be all and end all of history. I think for me, one of the objectives for history is to try to explain things. But it was wrong of me to suppose that by writing about a single individual and the event in a particular place with which his name is associated, I was in some fashion taking on something that was easily controlled, or by me, easily controllable. It may just be that I'm the kind of person who spills off into, hopefully interesting digressions in all kinds of different directions, no matter what it is that I'm trying to write about or to understand. So it was really, it was a different kind of challenge. It required me to attempt to understand things at a level that I had not previously attempted, at least in a book. I had never written biography before, and although this book really, there was a dearth of the kinds of materials that one could use to construct a biography. Nevertheless, I do think of it as a sort of an intellectual biography or an intellectual history of Nat Turner, even if it is just written on the basis of essentially one 26-page pamphlet, plus other stuff.
Yeah.
But
well, the scrutiny you bring is, and I would not say it feels digressive at all to read. It seems quite tightly organized. So, but I understand what you're saying. You had more room to explore. So I told our guests that I'd ask them each about a research find that or moment that was particularly useful to them or surprising, exciting. So Afia, do you have a moment like that, or a document, or something that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking about this a lot since you since you both posited the question. And for me, I think it was surprising to me. Specifically, I went to Ghana. I went to Accra, Ghana, and I went to a slave castle, the Elmina Castle. There, my family's from Ghana, and I was rather far into the book at that point. So the slave castle actually doesn't find its way into the novel necessarily, but just sort of being there, just the act of sort of walking around and experiencing it and thinking about the emotional impact of it, I felt shaped how I would then go on to sort of edit the book and think about the work I had done. So it wasn't so much going there to get history or get facts or find or discover anything necessarily in depth, although that was what I went there for, to build context. What I found was that that it was a very emotional experience, and it raised in me the question of how do I create this emotional experience in the book, right? How do I sort of how do you take fact and context and detail and make it an experience? And I think that's a question I continue to ask myself and don't necessarily have an answer for, but I think just it changed my view of what I was doing. It changed my view of what historical fiction should be or could be. It realigned what the book was without changing any details, which is interesting.
Wonderful, you had that opportunity. I know as a biographer, I'm always trying to, go in the footsteps, follow in the footsteps of my subjects, and it's lucky to have that opportunity. Brianna, did you have a light bulb moment?
Yeah, I don't know if it was a light bulb, but it was a source that really sort of stayed with me and affected me as I was writing. So as anyone who writes about detainees or incarcerated people will tell you, it's kind of a challenge of to figure out kind of what were people's lived experiences like in detention, because so much of our sources are the sources of the state, and this project has to rely really heavily on immigration service records and sheriff records. So I often find it really challenging to sort of attempt to think about what people's lived experiences were like, particularly in these old jails. But sometimes you just find something in the archive that just like stops you in your tracks. And my object like that was at the Schomburg Center in New York. They have the papers of this attorney who worked with Haitian asylum seekers throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. And Haitian asylum seekers start to be jailed in really significant numbers in the 70s. And they're the first group of asylum seekers that faces essentially mandatory detention in the US, which is really remarkable and now pretty common. But one of the things that they had in these papers was a funeral program that a Black church in Miami had held for a man named Terren DeVille, who killed himself in a Dade County jail in 1974. And from what I can tell, no one at this church knew him personally. I don't think he had any real connection to Miami. But they held this funeral for him basically as an act of political protest to say, like, this is what is happening to Black asylum seekers who are trying to come to this country. And so the funeral program, in the funeral program, they print his affidavit for asylum. So what he would have told immigration authorities to try to get asylum in the US. And it is so deeply haunting because one of the things that he just keeps repeating in this affidavit is that he is being arbitrarily jailed in Haiti, that he is like being subject to this abuse by Haitian law enforcement. And he has this line where he says, I like fear that I'm going to die in a Haitian jail. And it just obviously drives home the trauma of the fact that this person came here seeking asylum and he died in a Florida county jail. And there's this really beautiful line at the end of the funeral program that the pastor of the church writes, where he writes, this person was denied membership in our community while he was living. He was denied membership in Miami, in the United States, but like in death, we declare that this is one of our people. This is a member of our community, and we're going to mourn him as a member of our community. And so that just really stayed with me as a source and as sort of a reminder of just what exactly is happening here.
Yeah, and the importance of the work you're doing to create reminders too, and bring more people into our community through writing their history. Chris, do you have a moment or a document, or?
I sort of have, there's no one kind of key breakthrough moment. There were lots of little moments, and I've just been scribbling down a few as I've had the advantage of going last. So just to give you some examples, one was sitting in a seminar actually it was in Israel on a kibbutz, and listening to an Israeli legal historian named Levi Cooper talking about the way in which he was trying to understand a particular Hasidic rabbi through the sort of the artifacts of his text. And Levi was talking about the literary theorist Gerard Genet. And it suddenly occurred to me, I can do this. I can use this. This is a great way to, this helps me understand, the text of the Confessions. It was a way in to the Confessions. There was another trying to figure out how to overcome the absence of any real information about the death and dissection of Nat Turner. And I was reading Vic Gattrell's book, The Hanging Tree, which is a social and cultural history of execution in England. And lo and behold, Vic has this passage in which he talks about the execution of a man named William Corder in Bury St. Edmunds in 1828, so more or less contemporary with Turner's execution. And Corder is hung, and then he is dissected, surgical dissection, which is a part of the sentence intended to induce terror in the convicted, in the condemned. And what was interesting about this was that actually, as a consequence of Corder's dissection, the eminently respectable medical establishment who are attending the dissection then take his skin, and one of them uses the skin as the binding on a book that is the account of the trial and execution of William Corder. And this book still exists. It's in a museum in Bury St Edmunds in the UK to this day. And the thing about Nat Turner's execution is the stories that appear to be a sort of a local folklore of the souvenirs that his remains furnished. And that seems like sort of fantasy until you find that, you know, in 1828 in Bury St Edmunds in supposedly civilized United Kingdom, here they are using the skin of an executed man to bind a book which will commemorate his own execution. So, you know, public hangings, public executions breed a desire for souvenirs.
Yeah. Well, this
there
is
are others, but you know,
wretched.
just like tea.
Yes. Well, thank you. We're having a flood of questions of people interested in fiction and the bounds of fiction. And I think there's sort of two opposing questions, but maybe you can sort of answer them at once, Afia. One has to do with, you know, where is the bound of research or truth, what things you know to have happened? And obviously this affects writing about real people too, from what Chris has said. And you know, where do you draw the bounds of what you know and what you don't know? And conversely, if you're making up characters, is that actually kind of scary when you don't have much to document to back them up on?
Yeah. I was thinking of something Christopher just said actually about absence. The idea of the absence of information that you find and sort of filling up that vacuum is sort of the act of research, a little bit trying to fill up that vacuum and sometimes finding that you can't, which I think motivated a lot of what I was writing was finding information. So a mention of perhaps a treatment for a sickness. Oh, we use this kind of tea to heal this sickness, maybe mentioned offhandedly in a diary or something like that, and building an entire world from just that one detail. So I try to use facts as sort of my tent poles, right, and hold up my ideas, trying not to stray too far from that, and then furnish them a little bit with that natural imagination of just filling in what you can't know. And then I try to do the opposite by trying to catch myself out. So if I make something up, I'll try to research it and see if I can prove that didn't happen. So say there was the smell of smoke in a certain town in June 1865. If that didn't happen, then I try not to write it. If I can prove that couldn't have happened, then I'll try not to include it. So that's sort of my own personal little rule, is if I can get away with it through the research, then I will. But I think there's that natural sort of, again, filling up that vacuum that happens, and that's where the creativity builds. Yeah.
Great.
And then the other half of the question, I don't know if I answered that, but
yes, keep going. Well, do you want to?
The other half was, so the creation, is again, yes. I did, yes. The emptiness is sort of where you come up with those characters,
Yeah, terrific. So we're running out of time a little bit. I just have one question for Brianna. Giuliani showed up in your narrative here. Was it exciting to have, well, I don't know, or daunting to see that there he was back, when was it, in the 80s, 70s? Doing his work, and here he is now. I guess maybe this is sort of a question about your work and its application for now. You know, do you hope Giuliani reads what you have to say about it? No. I guess hope he reads a book at all.
I think he's gonna bore anything. Yeah, Giuliani, he makes a very quick appearance. He says, well, we'll build some detention centers, but we might not use them long term. This will probably be a short-term project. And that was a lie. So that's.
So, well, I think I'll ask Kit if we have any more questions. I don't think we do, but what I wanted to close by saying is that there actually was a fourth prize given this year. Every year we give a kind of career achievement acknowledgement prize. In the last 2 years, this prize has been renamed for Tony Horwitz, who was a former president of the Society, a wonderful journalist and historian in the tradition of Alan Nevins. And so this year, I just wanted to say, although we've announced it previously, that the winner of the Tony Horwitz Prize is Lonnie Bunch, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian. That's a prize for distinguished work in American history of wide appeal and enduring public significance. So thank you very much, Mass Historical Society, for giving us this opportunity to talk about these wonderful works. I hope the audience will read them and buy them, and I'll just hold them up once more so you can see. We have Nat Turner and Conjure Women, and in, I don't know how long, Brianna, it will be before your book is out. Probably it takes a little while, but is there a schedule yet, or?
I think it's like 2024, so.
Okay, that's not so far. Maybe we'll be in bookstores actively by then. So give us something to look forward to. Thank you. Thanks, Kid. And it's 7 o'clock. I guess we'll say good night. Do you want to come back on for a minute, Kid?
We shall. We just
Yes.
want to thank
Okay.
everyone for joining us this evening, and congratulations to all of you. And thank you for joining us in this conversation.